The morning alarm rang out across Kepler's edge like it did every day. The sound bounced off the metal buildings and called everyone to work. This place was far from Earth, just a bunch of buildings on a rocky planet where people were trying to make a new home. David Parker grabbed his tool bag and walked toward the main office building. Today there would be some kind of problem to fix. Maybe the water cleaning machines were acting up again. Or maybe the air makers that always seemed to break down when the weather got bad. Working as an engineer on frontier planets meant you had to be good at fixing things, creative when stuff broke, and sometimes just hope for the best when nothing worked right. David had been fixing things on colony worlds for 8 years now. He'd worked on 12 different planets, and Kepler's edge was giving him some of the hardest problems he'd ever seen. The colony spread out across a valley between red-brown mountains. All the buildings were the pre-made kind that got shipped from other worlds. Covered walkways connected everything so people could move around safely during the dust storms that happened a lot here. About 3,000 people lived here now, humans, Centauri, and some other alien species. And now, it looked like they had some kind of alien royalty visiting too, if that fancy ship that landed yesterday meant anything. Administrator Chen waved him down outside the main building. We have a big problem with the water systems in Section C. And our very important visitor inspection starts in 1 hour. David sighed. Section C was where all the most important equipment was kept, and it had been having problems for weeks. How bad is it? The main water recycling unit is completely broken. We're running on backup systems that weren't meant to work all the time like this. Chen looked worried. And our VIP is Princess Sarah of House Lumine. She's here to check how we're doing and maybe give us money from the Ethereum government to expand the colony. David had heard about the Ethereum royal family. Their people were really good at biotechnology and had a government that mixed old-style kings and queens with democratic voting. If Princess Sarah liked what she saw, the colony could get a lot of money for better equipment. But first, they had to keep everything working long enough to show her around. He made his way to Section C, where the broken recycling unit sat surrounded by pipes, filters, and computer screens showing error messages in 3 different languages. The backup systems were working so hard they sounded like they might break any day now. If David couldn't fix the main system soon, everyone in the colony would be in serious trouble. David was deep inside the machine, working on the filter parts, when he heard voices coming down the hallway. Administrator Chen's formal voice mixed with something that sounded musical and definitely not human. He could hear the steady footsteps of what sounded like guards. This facility processes about 80% of our water cleaning, Chen was saying as they walked into the maintenance area. David looked up from his work to see a small group of people looking at the information displays on the walls. The princess was easy to spot. She was tall and graceful, with silver skin and pointed ears that marked her as Ethereum nobility. Her hair was actual silver color and fell to her shoulders in waves. She moved with the kind of control that came from years of royal training. What surprised David was that she was asking really smart technical questions about how the systems worked and what would happen if they failed. The breakdown happened about 6 hours ago, Chen continued, pointing toward where David was working. Our chief engineer is fixing it now. Princess Sarah walked over to the recycling unit, clearly interested in what she was seeing. She studied the exposed parts with the kind of focus that showed she really understood this stuff, not just being polite because she was royalty. The filtration design is quite good, she said, her accent making even the technical words sound musical. This setup should handle contamination levels well above normal. David blinked in surprise. You know about water recycling systems? Ethereum colonies use similar technology, but we usually use bioadaptive filtration instead of mechanical separation. She crouched down next to the unit, being careful not to get in his way, but clearly looking at the problem. Have you thought that the main failure might be earlier in the process, in the chemical treatment part? David stopped what he was doing, thinking about what she said. You think the breakdown started somewhere else in the system? The error pattern suggests chemical imbalance rather than mechanical failure, she said, pointing to specific readings on the diagnostic screen. If the pH controls failed first, it would cause exactly this kind of problem downstream. David pulled up the historical data on his tablet and swore under his breath. She was absolutely right. The pH systems had been showing small problems for days, but he'd been treating them as minor issues instead of the real cause of everything. That's brilliant, he said, already changing what he was working on. I've been chasing the symptoms instead of the actual problem. Princess Sarah smiled, and David noticed it changed her whole face from royal seriousness to something much more human and friendly. Sometimes an outside view helps you see patterns that aren't obvious when you're inside the system. Working together, they found that the real problem was a batch of bad chemical controllers that had been installed the week before. David's hands-on experience combined with the princess's book knowledge made quick work of figuring out what was wrong. Within an hour, they had the main systems running again. Impressive work, Administrator Chen said, obviously relieved. Princess, I hope this doesn't make you think badly of how we run things here. On the contrary, she replied, watching David run final tests on the repaired system. How quickly you identified and solved the problem shows exactly the kind of ability to adapt that frontier colonies need. As they got ready to move on to the next stop on her inspection tour, Princess Sarah stayed by the water recycling unit, looking thoughtful. Something wrong? David asked, noticing she seemed hesitant to leave. I was thinking about how you approached the repair, she said. You changed strategies immediately when I gave you new information, without letting pride or old ideas interfere with finding the best solution. Well, when the alternative is everyone dying of thirst, ego becomes something you can't afford, David replied with a grin. That's a refreshing attitude, she said, then struggled a bit with one of the access panels that was stuck because of mineral buildup from the planet's atmosphere. David moved to help her, their hands briefly touching as he worked the panel free. There you go. Though I have to say, watching you troubleshoot technical problems, you'd make a cute wife for some lucky engineer. The words came out of his mouth before he could think about them. It was just casual friendly talk, the kind of joking around that was normal among colony workers. But Princess Sarah went completely still, her bright eyes widening as she stared at him with an expression he couldn't understand. The silence stretched on uncomfortably as Administrator Chen shifted nervously, and the Ethereum guards behind the princess suddenly seemed much more alert. David realized he'd said something important, though he had no idea what. Princess Sarah began, her voice barely above a whisper. I accept. David blinked in confusion. Accept what? Your proposal, she said, her formal composure cracking as a blush spread across her silver features. I accept your marriage proposal. The maintenance room fell completely silent, except for the gentle hum of the newly repaired recycling systems. David stared at the princess. Administrator Chen stared at both of them. The Ethereum guards looked like they were trying to figure out what kind of diplomatic mess had just happened. I was joking, David said weakly. Jokes about marriage are not recognized in Ethereum customs, Captain Linnell, the princess's guard commander, said seriously. Especially when made to members of the royal family in front of witnesses. David felt like the ground was moving under his feet as he realized his casual comment had somehow caused what looked like a major diplomatic incident. Princess Sarah was still staring at him with a mixture of shock and something that might have been hope. Princess, he began carefully. I think we need to talk. the colony's main conference room had never hosted a more bizarre meeting. Princess Sarah sat at one end of the polished metal table with her formal diplomatic escort, while David sat at the opposite end with Administrator Chen trying to mediate what was becoming an increasingly nervous situation. Captain Linnell stood at attention beside the princess, his expression suggesting he was mentally writing reports that would give his bosses headaches for months. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," David said, rubbing his temples against a growing headache. In Ethereum culture, any statement about marriage made to royalty is considered a binding contract proposal? Not any statement, Captain Linnell clarified with military precision. Specifically, direct offers of marriage made in the presence of witnesses, regardless of what you intended. But I was obviously joking. Intent is considered irrelevant, Princess Sarah said quietly, her hands folded in her lap with careful composure. The law assumes that people would not joke about such serious matters involving the royal family. Administrator Chen leaned forward with the expression of someone trying to save a diplomatic situation that had gotten completely out of control. "Princess, surely there must be some way to withdraw accidental proposals?" "There is," she replied, then paused. "However, I have already accepted." Under Ethereum law, that creates a binding engagement contract that requires formal legal proceedings to dissolve. David stared at her. "You accepted immediately. Why?" Princess Sarah's carefully maintained composure flickered, showing something vulnerable beneath the royal bearing. "Because acceptance was preferable to the alternative I was facing." Captain Linnell shifted uncomfortably. "Perhaps we should discuss this privately, Your Highness." "No," Princess Sarah said firmly. "If Mr. Parker is to be my fiancé, even temporarily, he deserves to understand the circumstances." She turned to face David directly, her bright eyes reflecting a mixture of embarrassment and determination. "I am currently avoiding an arranged marriage to Duke Aldrich of House Thornfield. The union has significant political advantages for both our families, but the Duke is personally objectionable." "How objectionable?" David asked. "He collects specimens," she said with barely suppressed disgust. "Living beings from various species, which he keeps in elaborate displays for his personal entertainment." David felt a chill run down his spine. "That sounds like slavery with extra steps." "Indeed." The arrangement was to be finalized upon my return from this inspection tour. Princess Sarah's voice took on a quality of quiet desperation. "Your accidental proposal offers legal protection that even my family cannot easily override." Administrator Chen's expression shifted from panic to calculating interest. "Protection that would require you to remain on Kepler's edge until the engagement is formally dissolved?" "Yes, which could take considerable time given the diplomatic complexities involved." David watched the administrator's face light up with possibilities. An extended royal visit would bring attention, funding, and trade opportunities that could transform the struggling colony. He could practically see Chen mentally calculating the economic benefits. "This is insane," David muttered. "I make one joke and suddenly I'm engaged to alien royalty." "Human Ethereum marriages are not unprecedented," Captain Linnell offered helpfully. "Though they typically involve extensive negotiations and cultural exchange agreements." "What kind of agreements?" Princess Sarah answered before her guard commander could respond. "Technology sharing, trade concessions, territorial considerations, family alliance structures." She trailed off, clearly realizing how overwhelming the list sounded. David stood up and began pacing the small conference room. "Okay, let me get this straight. If we go through with this fake engagement, you avoid marrying a psychopath who collects intelligent beings. The colony gets Ethereum development funding. And I get what, exactly? A very complicated life, Princess Sarah said with what might have been an attempt at humor. And if we don't, I return to Ethereum space, marry Duke Aldrich as scheduled, and spend the rest of my life as a trophy in his collection while he uses my royal connections to expand his influence. The stark honesty of her words hit David harder than he'd expected. He studied her face, noting the fear she was trying to hide beneath royal training and diplomatic composure. What happens if we actually went through with it? He asked. Hypothetically, the marriage contract would require negotiation between your colonial government and my family's representatives, Captain Linnell explained. Terms would include your citizenship status, inheritance rights, territorial considerations. I'd have to become Ethereum nobility, or the princess would renounce her titles and become a colonial citizen, Princess Sarah said quietly. Either option is complex. David sat back down, his engineering mind automatically beginning to analyze the problem from multiple angles. The technical challenges were huge, but the basic issue was straightforward. Princess Sarah needed protection from an unwanted marriage, and his accidental proposal had provided it. How long would a fake engagement buy you? He asked. Months, possibly years, depending on the legal challenges involved. Long enough to find alternative solutions to the political pressures I'm facing. And during that time? Princess Sarah met his gaze directly. I would remain here, fulfilling my inspection duties and working on development projects with colonial leadership. David found himself studying her with new appreciation. Her technical knowledge during the water system repair had been genuinely impressive, and her questions about colonial infrastructure suggested real understanding of the challenges they faced. You'd actually be useful, he realized aloud. I prefer to think of myself as potentially valuable rather than merely useful, she replied with dry humor that reminded David why he'd been enjoying their conversation before everything became complicated. Administrator Chen cleared his throat diplomatically. Mr. Parker, I should mention that the Colonial Development Authority has been seeking qualified consultants for our expansion projects. Princess Sarah's credentials would make her extremely valuable for infrastructure planning and interspecies relations. David recognized the political maneuvering, but found himself more interested in the practical implications. Working with Princess Sarah on engineering problems could actually be productive, regardless of their complicated personal situation. What happens to your royal duties? He asked. I would be fulfilling them by conducting an extended evaluation of colonial development potential, she replied. My family would be displeased by the delay, but they could not argue with the strategic value of a detailed assessment. And Duke Aldrich? Princess Sarah's expression darkened. Would be forced to wait, though he will certainly not do so quietly. He has considerable influence and few moral constraints on how he uses it. David weighed his options. He could withdraw his accidental proposal and send Princess Sarah back to a fate that clearly terrified her, or he could commit to a fake engagement with diplomatic complications that stretched far beyond his understanding. The decision, he realized, was actually quite simple. All right, he said, looking directly at Princess Sarah. I accept your acceptance. Her face transformed with relief so profound that David felt a protective instinct he hadn't known he possessed. Really? She asked. Really. Though I should warn you, colonial life isn't exactly royal palace luxury. Mr. Parker, Princess Sarah said with the first genuine smile he'd seen from her, after spending years avoiding Duke Aldrich's advances, a functioning water recycling system sounds like paradise. 3 weeks into their unconventional engagement, David had to admit that Princess Sarah was proving to be exactly the kind of partner he'd never known he wanted. Her theoretical knowledge of infrastructure systems combined with his hands-on experience had resolved more colonial problems than he'd managed in the previous 6 months working alone. The atmospheric processor efficiency could be improved by 30% with bioadaptive filtration, she said, reviewing the morning's diagnostic reports while they shared breakfast in the colony's central cafeteria. Ethereum colonies use hybrid systems that self-adjust to environmental changes. The initial setup cost would be enormous, David replied, though he was already sketching modification possibilities on his tablet. But the long-term savings would more than justify the investment. Their professional partnership had developed naturally, with Sarah's administrative expertise complementing David's engineering skills in ways that made both of them more effective. What surprised him was how much he enjoyed simply talking with her about work, about the colony's future, about the dozen small decisions that shape daily life on a frontier world. "David," she said carefully, setting down her coffee cup. "May I ask you something personal?" "Shoot." "Do you ever regret the accidental proposal? I know this situation has complicated your life considerably." David considered the question while watching the morning shift workers heading to their assignments. The past few weeks had been the most professionally satisfying of his career, and Sarah's presence had added dimensions to his daily routine that he hadn't realized were missing. "Honestly? No," he said. "I mean, the diplomatic stuff is way over my head, but working with you has been great. You actually understand the technical side of infrastructure development." Sarah's smile was radiant. "I've been thinking the same thing. I never imagined that practical engineering could be so fulfilling." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Administrator Chen, whose expression carried the kind of stress that indicated another crisis requiring immediate attention. "We have a problem," he announced without preamble. "Duke Aldrich has arrived." David felt Sarah go rigid beside him. "Here? On Kepler's Edge?" "His ship docked an hour ago. He's traveling with a full diplomatic escort and legal advisors." Chen's voice carried barely controlled panic. "He's demanding an immediate audience to contest Princess Sarah's engagement on grounds of cultural manipulation and fraud." "Can he do that?" David asked. "Ethereum marriage law is complex," Sarah said quietly, her earlier happiness replaced by the kind of controlled fear that made David want to punch something. "If he can prove the engagement was obtained through deception or coercion, it could be declared invalid. But I genuinely proposed, even if accidentally, and you genuinely accepted. The issue is whether I had the legal authority to accept without royal council approval for interspecies marriage contracts." David was beginning to understand why Sarah had been so desperate to avoid Duke Aldrich. The man hadn't just followed her across space to contest their engagement. He'd come prepared with legal challenges that could force her return regardless of her personal preferences. "Where is he now?" Sarah asked. "Conference room A, reviewing colonial records and demanding documentation of Mr. Parker's citizenship status, financial resources, and genetic compatibility assessments." "Genetic compatibility?" David asked incredulously. "Ethereum royal marriages require biological analysis to ensure offspring viability," Sarah explained with obvious embarrassment. "It's an archaic requirement, but legally binding." David stood up, his protective instincts overriding his natural caution. "Well, let's go meet this Duke and get this sorted out." "David, you don't understand," Sarah said urgently. "Aldrich is dangerous. He spent years maneuvering for political advantage, and he won't hesitate to destroy anyone who threatens his plans." "Then it's a good thing I don't scare easily." The confrontation in conference room A was everything David had expected and worse. Duke Aldrich was tall, elegant, and carried himself with the kind of supreme confidence that came from never being told no about anything that mattered to him. His entourage filled half the room: legal advisors, diplomatic attaches, and what appeared to be personal security wearing ceremonial armor that didn't quite conceal advanced weaponry. "Ah, Princess Sarah," Aldrich said with oily charm as they entered. "And this must be the colonial engineer who thinks he can claim royal blood through trickery." "Duke Aldrich," Sarah replied with icy formality. "I wasn't aware you had business on Kepler's Edge." "My business is protecting Ethereum royal interests from exploitation," he replied, then turned his attention to David with obvious disdain. "You are David Parker, the man claiming engagement to Her Royal Highness?" "I am," David said simply, meeting the Duke's stare without flinching. "A frontier engineer with no family connections, minimal financial resources, and questionable genetic compatibility," Aldrich continued, consulting a data tablet. "Hardly suitable for royal alliance." "Suitability isn't determined by financial statements," David replied evenly. "Isn't it?" Aldrich's smile was predatory. "Princess Sarah requires a partner who can provide security, status, and appropriate breeding prospects for continuation of royal bloodlines." "What exactly do you offer that meets those requirements?" David felt anger building but forced himself to remain calm. "I offer respect, partnership, and the freedom to make her own choices." Romantic sentiment, Aldrich dismissed, but irrelevant to royal duty. "Princess Sarah's marriage serves political purposes that transcend personal preference." "My marriage serves my purposes," Sarah interjected with steel in her voice. "And my choice is David." "Your choice is uninformed and legally questionable," Aldrich countered. "The engagement contract requires royal council approval for interspecies unions. Without that approval, your acceptance is invalid." One of his legal advisors stepped forward with documentation. "We have prepared formal challenges to the engagement on grounds of procedural violation, genetic incompatibility, and cultural manipulation." David looked at the stack of legal documents and realized they were facing exactly the kind of bureaucratic warfare that Sarah had been trying to avoid. Aldrich had come prepared to tie them up in legal proceedings that could drag on for years while keeping Sarah trapped in limbo. "There's another option," David said quietly. Everyone in the room turned to look at him. "What option?" Sarah asked. "You could renounce your royal titles and become a colonial citizen. Then Ethereum marriage law wouldn't apply to our engagement." The silence that followed was deafening. Aldrich's expression shifted from predatory confidence to shocked outrage, while Sarah stared at David with something approaching wonder. "That would be unprecedented," she whispered. "So is everything else about this situation," David replied. "The question is whether you want to spend your life fighting legal battles to avoid an unwanted marriage, or whether you want to build something new here on Kepler's Edge." "You're asking her to abandon everything," Aldrich snarled. "Her heritage, her position, her responsibilities to her people." "I'm asking her what she wants," David said, then looked directly at Sarah. "Not what's politically convenient, not what tradition requires, but what would actually make her happy." Princess Sarah looked around the conference room, at Duke Aldrich's barely contained rage, at the legal documents that would trap her in years of court proceedings, at Administrator Chen's hopeful expression, and finally at David's steady gaze. "I want to build something new," she said clearly. "I renounce my claim to the Ethereum throne and choose colonial citizenship." The explosion of protests from Aldrich's delegation drowned out everything else. But David only had eyes for Sarah's face as she smiled with genuine joy for the first time since he'd known her. "Are you sure?" he asked quietly. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," she replied, taking his hand. "Let's build something amazing together." The formal renunciation ceremony took place 3 days later in the colony's main assembly hall, witnessed by representatives from a dozen different species who had traveled to Kepler's Edge for what was being called the most significant interspecies wedding in recent memory. Princess Sarah, now simply Sarah Parker, colonial citizen, stood beside David as Administrator Chen conducted the proceedings with barely controlled excitement about the diplomatic coup his colony had achieved. Do you, Sarah of House Lumine, formally renounce all claims to Ethereum royal succession and accept full citizenship in the Kepler's Edge colonial territory? Chen asked with ceremonial gravity. I do, Sarah replied clearly, her voice carrying across the packed assembly hall. And do you, David Parker, accept the responsibilities of marriage partnership with full knowledge of the cultural and diplomatic complexities involved? David looked at Sarah, remembering the desperate princess who had frozen at his casual comment weeks ago, and seeing instead the confident woman who had chosen to build a new life rather than accept the constraints of her birth. I do, he said, meaning it completely. The celebration that followed lasted well into the night, with the colony's residents joined by visiting diplomats, trade representatives, and curious observers from throughout the sector. Duke Aldrich had departed immediately after Sarah's renunciation, his legal challenges rendered meaningless by her change in citizenship status, though his parting threat suggested the matter was far from resolved in his mind. Any regrets? David asked Sarah as they stood on the observation deck outside their new shared quarters, watching the binary stars that dominated Kepler's Edge's night sky. About renouncing my titles? She considered the question seriously. None whatsoever. For the first time in my life, I'm building something instead of maintaining something that someone else created. And about marrying an accidental fiancé? Sarah turned to face him, her expression soft in the starlight. David, what started as an accident became the best decision I've ever made. You offered me something I never thought I could have, the freedom to be myself rather than a symbol. Their first year of marriage proved to be everything David had hoped and more challenging than he'd anticipated. Sarah's administrative skills and technical knowledge made her invaluable to the colony's development projects, while her former royal connections brought trade opportunities that transformed Kepler's Edge from a struggling outpost into a thriving commercial hub. The challenges came from unexpected directions. Sarah had to learn practical skills that royal education had never covered, from basic equipment maintenance to the kind of hands-on problem-solving that frontier life demanded. David found himself navigating diplomatic complexities as Sarah's husband put him in the position of representing colonial interests in negotiations that could affect entire star systems. The atmospheric processing plant is running at 95% efficiency, Sarah reported during their monthly review meeting with the Colonial Council. The bioadaptive modifications have exceeded all performance projections. Revenue from the new trade agreements is up 400% from last year, Administrator Chen added with obvious satisfaction. We're actually showing a profit for the first time since the colony was established. David looked around the council chamber, noting how it had evolved from a bare-bones administrative center into something resembling a real governmental facility. Maps of planned expansion areas covered the walls, while displays showed shipping schedules, resource allocation charts, and development timelines that stretched years into the future. We're not just surviving anymore, he realized aloud. We're actually thriving. We're building something that never existed before, Sarah corrected. A community where different species contribute their unique strengths toward common goals. The truth of her words became evident over the following years as Kepler's Edge grew from a frontier settlement into a recognized hub for interspecies cooperation. Their engineering and administrative consultancy became the most successful business in the sector, with requests for their services coming from colonies throughout known space. 5 years after David's accidental proposal, they stood in the same maintenance room where their unlikely romance had begun, watching their 3-year-old daughter attempt to help repair a water recycling unit by handing him tools in random order. "Daddy, This one?" little Elena asked, offering him a molecular wrench that was nearly as large as she was. "That's perfect, sweetheart," David said, accepting the tool with appropriate gravity before setting it aside in favor of the actual tool he needed. Sarah laughed at their daughter's serious expression as she rummaged through the toolkit for her next contribution. Elena had inherited her mother's silver hair and luminous eyes, along with her father's stubborn determination to understand how everything worked. "She's going to be a formidable engineer," Sarah observed. "Or a diplomat," David countered. "She's already figured out how to get what she wants through strategic tool distribution." "Why not both?" Sarah asked. "The galaxy could use more people who understand that building bridges is more valuable than maintaining barriers." David finished the repair and powered up the system, noting with satisfaction that the bioadaptive modifications Sarah had designed were still performing flawlessly after 5 years of continuous operation. Their work had become a model for sustainable colonial infrastructure throughout the sector. "You know," he said, watching Elena carefully sort tools by size with the kind of methodical precision that reminded him of both her parents, "I've been thinking about expanding our family." Sarah froze in exactly the same way she had 5 years ago, her eyes widening as she processed his words. For a moment, David worried he'd somehow triggered another cultural misunderstanding. Then her face broke into a radiant smile. "Is that a proposal, Mr. Parker?" "More of a suggestion for discussion, Mrs. Parker," he replied, grinning at the familiar pattern. "Though I should probably be more careful about my phrasing around you." "Probably," she agreed, moving closer to wrap her arms around his waist. "But I like your suggestions. They tend to lead to interesting developments." Elena looked up from her tool sorting with the serious expression of a 3-year-old who sensed important adult conversation happening above her head. "Daddy make joke again?" "Something like that, sweetheart," David said, scooping her up into a hug. "What do you think about having a little brother or sister?" Elena considered this with the gravity of someone being consulted on matters of cosmic importance. "Can help with tools?" "Definitely," Sarah laughed. "Though it might be a few years before they're ready for advanced equipment management." As they packed up their tools and prepared to head home for dinner, David reflected on how completely his life had changed since that offhand comment about cute wives. What had begun as an accident had become the foundation for everything that mattered to him, a marriage built on mutual respect and shared purpose, a daughter who embodied the best of both her parents' heritages, and work that made a real difference in the lives of thousands of people. "David," Sarah said as they walked through the colony's evening bustle toward their home, "do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't made that joke?" "You'd probably be married to Duke Aldrich and miserable," he replied honestly. "And you'd probably still be fixing water recyclers by yourself." "True. Though I have to admit, the water recyclers were a lot less complicated before I started working with alien royalty." "Former alien royalty," she corrected with mock dignity. "Current colonial citizen and mother of future engineers and diplomats," David added. "And whatever else she decides to become," Sarah finished, watching Elena run ahead to greet the neighbors who had become their extended family over the years. That evening, as they tucked Elena into bed and settled in for their usual review of the next day's projects, David found himself marveling at how naturally their life had evolved from crisis to partnership to something deeper than either of them had originally imagined possible. "Sarah," he said as they reviewed reports about a new colony requesting their consultation services, "I know this isn't how either of us planned our lives to go." "No," she agreed, leaning against his shoulder as they worked. "It's better than anything I could have planned." "Even giving up being a princess?" "Especially that," she said firmly. "Being a princess meant representing someone else's vision of what I should be. Being your wife means building our own vision of what we want to become." Outside their window, Kepler's edge sparkled with lights that represented thousands of beings from dozens of species, all working together to create something that had never existed before, a truly integrated interstellar community where differences were strengths rather than obstacles. "I love you," David said simply, the words carrying all the wonder he still felt about their unlikely journey together. "I love you too," Sarah replied, then smiled with the same mixture of surprise and delight that had marked the beginning of their adventure. "And I accept your suggestion about expanding our family." "Just like that?" "Just like that. Though this time, I'm pretty sure you meant it as more than a joke." David kissed her temple, breathing in the scent of her hair and feeling the comfortable weight of their daughter sleeping safely down the hall. "This time, I definitely meant it." Their second child was born 8 months later, a son who inherited his father's stubborn engineering instincts and his mother's diplomatic grace. The colony celebrated his arrival as enthusiastically as they had his parents' wedding, recognizing that the next generation would carry forward the principles of cooperation and mutual respect that had transformed their community. Years later, when visitors asked about the origins of Kepler's Edge's remarkable success as an interspecies colony, the story always came back to a joke about cute wives that had somehow become the foundation for one of the galaxy's most celebrated love stories. David and Sarah would usually laugh when they heard these tales, knowing that the real story was both simpler and more complex than the romantic legend suggested. What had started as an accidental proposal had become a deliberate choice to build something better together than either could have achieved alone. And sometimes, late at night when they were reviewing plans for their next project or watching their children sleep, they would look at each other and marvel at how a single moment of unexpected honesty had changed not just their own lives, but the lives of everyone around them. After all, the best relationships, whether between individuals or entire civilizations, often begin with someone being brave enough to say exactly what they mean, even when they don't realize they mean it. The end.